So the way this is going to work, I'm going to talk to you for about half an hour in a presentation, and then we're going to have some opportunity for question and answers at the end. You should have a box you can see, so you'll be able to input questions. You can input them as we go through, but we will do that question and answer at the end. So you're aware, this is a webinar aimed at our alternative providers. I know we've got some HEIs with us as well, so the overall principles apply to anyone who'll be submitting data futures, but this webinar is focused on those APs. So if we get started then talking about the scope of the collection. As a lot of you will be aware, Data Futures aims to take 3 current collections and translate those into one new data model. So we've got our alternative provider student record, our student record, and the initial teacher training record. And the aim of our collection design and detailed design phases was to combine those into one new data model. And here you have a simplified version of that overall model. That is a translation of those current collections into this new model here. So if we make that a bit bigger, hopefully you'll be seeing there some things that you recognize. So things, student courses, entry qualifications, these are hopefully things that are familiar to you. There are some new concepts in here that have been refined over the past 2 years of putting together this model through collection and detailed design. Some of these might be unfamiliar to you, but hopefully do relate to some of the things you're doing now. So for example, in the middle there, you've got your student course session, and that is a new concept in the model, but is broadly, with some differences, similar to what you might know now as an instance period if you're involved in the AP student collection. We're not going to be going into full detail of the model today. As I said, we'll be focusing on the key concepts of data submission and behaviour, but we will be offering webinars in the future around the data model. So if you keep an eye out for those, if anyone would like to be involved, we'll be able to go into more detail around the data model there. So the first key concept we're going to be talking about is around the data collection schedule. What you should see in front of you now is your current data collection schedule for the AP student record. So again, those of you who have been involved in the submission, this should be quite familiar. We have a reporting year that runs from the 1st of August to the 31st of July, and at the end of that reporting year, after it's completed, you tell us about all the activity that has happened in that previous year. So it's a retrospective collection. You're collecting data throughout that year from August to July about everything that's happening, students joining, students leaving, all of that activity, and then once that year is over, you submit it to us in that the peak of the submission around September, October, November, where you go through that full data quality assurance and submission process, with the final submission at the end of November and signing off that data in December. What we're moving to is a system of continuous data collection. So the data collection in this new model will never close. It's open throughout the year. So rather than at the moment where you have your 15-16 AP return and then your 16-17, then your 17-18, this moves to one continuous student collection that aggregates over time. This will be split into 3 reference periods, and we'll go into a little more detail about what those are later. But that is a way of breaking up that year when we have a continuous collection into these reference periods. But the way you submit data is relating to your business events within your provider. So rather than submitting everything that happened in a reporting year at the end of that year, the idea is that you submit data to us as it happens. So as things change, you let us know about those changes. A new student joins, you let us know you've got a new student. A student leaves, you let us know they've left. So it's driven by when events happen at your provider, you let Hisa know what's happened and submit that data to us. In practice, that means a couple of things. So firstly, it means if nothing happens during a particular period, then you don't tell us anything's happened. And if nothing has changed about a certain piece of data, you don't have to keep returning it. So you only return things to us when something's new, something's changed, or something's being corrected. So for example, when a new student joins you, you submit a lot of data to us about them, so their name and some of their personal characteristics and those kinds of things. And if those things never change, student never changed their name or any of their characteristics, you don't have to keep telling us that. You don't have to tell us that again. Whereas in the current collection, a lot of that data you would have to return to us each year. In the new world, you only return those things to us again if they change. It also means you don't have to wait to submit some data. So, for example, a lot of you will have a lot of your enrolments around September time. You've got a lot of new students joining you in September. And in the current collection, if we put those two side by side, you'd have a lot of data on those students in September. All of their details of their entry qualifications and their characteristics, and you have to wait over a year really until you have our full functionality on our system available and our full quality assurance process for you to be able to fully submit, finalize and sign off that data. So as I said, it's you're collecting the data throughout the year and saving it up for that final submission a year later. In this new data collection, as I said, it's constantly open, so you'll be able to submit that data as it happens, as you have it available. So rather than saving up all of that process and quality assurance for a bit of a bottleneck in that October-November time, you'll be able to spread the load throughout the year and submit that data as it happens. So all your enrolments can be submitted in September if that's when your enrolments are. So if we go on to a little more detail about what these reference periods are, we split the year up into 3 reference periods, and you've got a definition there on the screen. So a fixed period of time, the end of which aligns to Hisa's statutory and public purpose customers, requires sector-wide data and information. So there are some similarities between these and what you now know as a reporting year, in that the end of each reference period you'll have to have a finalised data that you've signed off and will be disseminated to our statutory customers and included in publications. So in that way they are similar to what you now know as a reporting year. However, the differences that we'd emphasise is that submission is not tied to reference periods in the same way that your submission is tied to the reporting year at the moment. So when you submit data to us, it's driven by those business events in your provider, as I've said. So a student joins, a student leaves, you've confirmed a new course, you tell us about those things. Regardless of the reference periods, you tell us about them in the reference period they've happened, but not in the same way as you have now, where everything is tied to specifically what happened in a reporting year. So the collection system is always open, and HE providers can continuously submit, quality assure, and view the consolidated data using our Data Futures platform throughout the year. The model that we've designed is designed to follow the structure of your provider's courses, which in a lot of cases will be an annual structure, but it's not attached to specific years or reference periods. So if you have starters that start in September and some that start in January, they'll be submitted in very similar ways, just at different times of the year. So for those of you who do have January starters or April starters, you'll have experienced the challenges with your instance periods crossing reporting years and having to chop up those years of study to align with our reporting years. In the new world, your September and January starters will be submitted in a very similar way to each other. So just when they start, you'll let us know they've started, and as they continue through their course, complete their activity, you let us know about that as it happens, rather than having to align everything to our reporting year. This also means that within our data model, there are not certain entities that apply to particular reference periods. So it's not the case that we're looking for all your entry information at one time of year or your qualifications at another time of year. It's just a case of when things happen. So it might be that if you have most of your students starting in September and leaving in at sort of May, June time, that naturally the structure of your courses means that certain entities will only be submitted in certain reference periods. So at some smaller providers, I know it's the case that in some reference periods you might just have no student leaves. No student leaves any of your courses during that time. And if that were to be the case, then you just wouldn't submit any leaving information during that particular reference period. However, if you have different structured courses, or you have students starting and leaving at different times of year, then all data is potentially applicable to any reference period. It's just dependent on what is going on in your provider during that period of time. So as I said, the year is split up into 3 reference periods, and I'll just let you know when those are. So they run from the 1st of August to the end of November, and then the 1st of December to the end of March, and then the 1st of April to the end of July. So we've split the year up into these even 4-month periods, 3 4-month periods throughout the year. And they have been chosen to align to a traditional academic year, as this is the most common timetable and reflects the majority of activity and also the principal regulatory activities that depend on the data. However, as I've said, the flexibility of the model and this process of continuous submission throughout the year does allow that flexibility for you to submit the data as it fits in with your own timetables and activities and delivery patterns and courses with different start dates. So what happens at the end of a reference period? As I said, similar to a reporting year, at the end of a reference period, we need a sign off. We need each provider to sign off their data, and as it is in the current world, that needs to be done by the head of your provider. So at the end of each reference period, there is a sign-off period during which you have the opportunity to quality assure your data, iron out any issues, and make any resubmissions as necessary before signing off that data. So it's similar to what you might know now as that time between you committing your data and then signing off the data, where you'll have the opportunity to go through quality assurance, with different people being involved in that process, make any resubmissions that you need to, and then sign off the data with us. Once the data is signed off, we have our dissemination point at the end of that sign-off period. So that's the point where the data is delivered to our statutory customers, so your funding councils, and also internally to our teams at Hisa who deal with the publication, so that that data can be included in those publications. So here you've got a bit of an example of the process of submitting a file to Hisa and the steps that it might go to. Some of these will hopefully be familiar to you. So you upload a file to us, and some of the steps we go through now will occur. So we run some validation on that file. We generate some reports for you, which may be similar to the ones you have now, to help you out with looking at your data and quality assuring that data. One step that's a bit new in this process is to do with aggregating the data. So because this is one continuous collection that never closes, it works a bit differently to the way it works now. So currently, if you upload 50 files to us, we're only ever interested in that final file. So the final file you upload is the one you commit, the one that you sign off. In the new world, you upload many files to us, and each one will add to the previous one. So if you upload a file that has one student in it to make an update to that student, then that will be combined with all of your previous files. So when you submit a new file to us, it's all aggregated together to create a consolidated data set of everything that you've submitted to us. Then in that process, you've got that period of improving the quality. And there will be different people involved in that process, as there are now. So yourselves, quality assuring your data internally, Hisa, and your funding council as well, being involved in getting that data the highest quality that it can be. And then once you're ready for sign off, getting that data signed off. We've got a definition there of sign-off, so the process of a defined role, for example, a Vice-Chancellor making a formal declaration that the in-scope data submitted to Hisa represents an honest, impartial and rigorous account of the HE provider's events up to the end of the reference period. So I'll go into a bit more detail about what we mean by in-scope later, but essentially what we mean is that it's the data that is relevant to a particular reference period for sign-off. So as it is now, data must be signed off by the head of your provider, so whether that's your Vice Chancellor, Principal Director, whoever that is in your provider, and it must be signed off at least once each reference period. You can sign it off more than once if you, after sign off, you find that you need to make a correction and sign it off again, but it must be signed off at least once per reference period so that that data can then be disseminated. So once you've signed off the data, as I said, we have this dissemination point. And this is the specified date following the end of a reference period by which signed off data will be extracted and supplied to Hisa's data customers. Data disseminated at the dissemination point will be used for official accounts of the higher education provider's activity for statistical, regulatory and public information purposes. So those are a lot of the same purposes that you use for your data now. Is sent to your funding council for their regulatory and monitoring, and also go into Hisa's publication. The exact dates that we've got for these dissemination points are yet to be decided. There's something that we want to test through our alpha and beta pilots that we're kicking off next year, because we know that sign-off period between the end of the reference period and the dissemination point is quite important to get right. We need to balance the desire for timely data, so we want to get that data signed off and ready to go as soon as possible during the year, but we have to balance that against making sure providers have enough time to go through that quality assurance and get that data signed off. So we do have some draft dates here on this screen. As you can see, the dotted lines show the end of the reference periods, and then you've got the dissemination points as a solid line after that. But I should emphasize these are draft dates, and there's something we'll be looking into refining. So the idea is here that the reference period 1 will be all signed off and done and dusted before Christmas, and then reference periods 2 and 3 have slightly longer sign-off periods to get that data quality assured and signed off. But like I said, these are at the moment draft dates, as these have not yet been confirmed. So I mentioned earlier in-scope periods, and that is the duration for which each entity is relevant for sign-off by an HE provider. Data submitted prior to the in-scope period will not require sign-off until it becomes in-scope. Submission after this period will be subject to exception processing. So essentially what these do is they define any data you submit to us. The in-scope dates define whether or not that data needs to be signed off in a particular reference period. So there's a recognition of the fact that this is in-year data collection, and therefore not all new data that you submit to us during a reference period might apply to that reference period, because the collection's always open. So at the moment, when you sign off your data in the AP student collection, you sign off everything that's in your final file, all of that data. But in the new collection, it may be you've submitted some data ahead of time, or it may be you've been correcting data that it is now after its in-scope period. So these definitions of the in-scope periods of each entity define whether or not they need to be signed off in any particular reference period. So every entity will have one of these in-scope periods based on a start date and end date formulas, which define when that comes into scope for validation and sign-off. The in-scope periods for each entity will generally be set with start dates relevant to either curriculum data related or student related start dates. So just dependent on what the entity is will affect what these in-scope periods are. Some entities will be applicable to be signed off in multiple reference periods. So if those in-scope start and end dates cross multiple reference periods, then that data needs to be signed off multiple times in each reference period where it applies. So a couple of examples of when something you submitted might not be in scope. So you can submit some data ahead of time, so before it applies. We have several entities in our model that collect curriculum data, so data about, for example, your courses. And if you know that you're going to be running a course a couple of years in advance or a year in advance, or even a few months in advance of when you'll be running it, you can submit that data to us with details of that course and the course delivery that you will be running in the future. However, if you have submitted it ahead of time and it doesn't apply until a future reference period, you won't be required to sign off that data until it comes into scope. So until we've reached the point where that particular delivery of that course starts and you've got students studying on that course. Submission after your in-scope period will be subject to exception processing. And this is a process that we're still ironing out the details of. But we will need to have some kind of process for processing data that needs to be corrected after the end of an in-scope period. So in theory, when you sign off your data during a reference period, say a student's completed a year of a course and you give us all the details about that year of that course and sign it off, and that has now finished, so the end date of that is in a previous reference period. In theory, that's done and dusted. It's all correct, you got it right the first time. However, we know there may be cases where corrections need to be made to that data. So there will need to be a process in place that allows for what we're referring to here as exception processing and historical amendments of data. So those of you are familiar with our fixed database process now, where you have where some providers are required to correct data that have been submitted in previous years. This is the process that will replace that in this new world of continuous data collection. It will need to be a bit different, but there has to be a process in place to allow providers to submit data that was incorrect in a previous reference period with the authorization of our statutory customers. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about data submission behavior. And this is the current world in the dull grey colours. And so you have a lot of students, you're the HE provider there on the left, you have students who interact with you, and that interaction produces data, and you're storing that within your HE provider, and that may be within a student record system or whatever system you have at your provider that allows you to store that data. You're then moving that over to the right and submitting that to Hisa, going through the quality assurance process, resubmitting, and sending that to the Hisa data collection system in what ultimately will be one file. So you have one submission that is then quality assured, resubmitted if you need to, and signed off. In the shiny, colourful new world, over on the left, that's very similar. You have students interacting with you in the same ways, producing data, and that data being stored by yourselves. But what's changed is that the way that moves over to the right onto the Hisa data platform. So rather than one big submission, what we have here is several fragments. So these are smaller files that contain subsets of the data that you submit to us. And as I've mentioned earlier, those are aggregated together in order to produce the final data set that is signed off in each reference period. So rather than one annual return, it's an ongoing update process where those fragments of data are built up over time to create that complete picture of what is going on at your provider. These could be larger files, these could be smaller files. If I put those two side by side, you can see the difference there. Fragments, as I said, could be smaller files or larger files. We encourage HE providers to move towards smaller data submissions, so submitting smaller chunks of data to us as events happen at your provider. However, we know that there are different capabilities and challenges facing providers that are going to affect the way that you interact with our new data platform and the new model. But what we would recommend is not saving up all of your data until the end of the reference period. So all of that submission process and quality assurance is spread over a larger amount of time rather than in a big rush at the end of any reference period. So that is an overview for you of some of the key concepts around data futures. I'm going to let you know about some of the things that are still to come during the alpha phase. So for those of you who don't know, we're running an alpha pilot next year from sort of springtime. And these are a small group of providers that have been selected from some volunteers to help us test out some of our processes and systems and model as well. So they'll be submitting small sets of data and helping us to test out some of these principles and processes. In selecting those providers, one of the big aims is to make sure we have a range. So we've got some alternative providers on there and some HEIs as well. So during that process, we'll be giving you some more information. We're going to have some particular scenarios that are going to help us with that alpha process. So these are example student journeys. And some will be very straightforward and some will be more complex to make sure that we've got a range of different student experiences and journeys covered within that pilot. We've talked a bit about the collection schedule and those reference periods dates, but we'll be letting you know some more detail about the transition between the current collections and the new world as well. Hopefully some of you have seen we have published a data specification on our website that goes with the data model and lets you know all of the fields and when they will be required. At the moment that's missing guidance, which we know you need to help you interpret that and implement it. So we're working on that as well and we'll be adding to it. As well as quality rules to make sure those are included to help with your quality assurance as well, and those in-scope dates that I've mentioned earlier. So when certain entities will be required for sign-off. We've also got Derive Field, so these are used in the current collection. So when you submit your data to us, we produce additional data based on that. So we derive from your data new information about those students. We need to define those against the new model, and credibility reports and other reports as well. So when you submit that data to us, we have effective ways of presenting that back to you and summarizing that to help you with your quality assurance and how that is going to work. So as I said, the alpha phase kicks off next spring and will be over the next years. We'll be releasing this information to you iteratively to get you what you need in order to get set up for submission. So that's an overview of the key concepts. What I hope that's demonstrated is that there are some familiarities there. There's some stuff you recognise, hopefully, aligned with your current submission, but there also are some quite key differences in the way that we'll be approaching the data collection and submission. We're going to pause now to give you a chance to ask some questions. I'm going to put myself on mute and you should have a box in front of you where you can type some questions. We're going to give it about 5 minutes and then we'll come back online and hopefully get through as many of those questions as we can for you. Hello again everyone, and thanks very much for the questions that you've submitted. We've got quite a few here, so we're going to get through as many as we can. I will let my colleague introduce himself, who's going to help us out with some of the questions as well.
So we might as well use this as a test as well, just to see if you can hear both of us okay. So my name's Simon Robshaw, I'm Hisa's data architect. So if you can hear me, please put your hand up. Good. You can see hands.
Yay.
That's
okay.
Good news.
So we're just going to dive right in and get started on some of these questions. We've had one from someone asking about some of the new data requirements, so things that APs have previously not had to submit, and whether these will apply to all providers or whether alternative providers will not have to submit these. The answer to that is that the data requirements are defined by your regulatory body. So at the moment, for many of you, that is HEFKey. From next year, that's going to become the Office for Students. So when the Office for Students comes into force, they're going to be defining your data requirements. So the challenge we've got at the moment is that means that your data requirements have not yet been fully defined. So some of these new requirements that you're seeing in the model,
we'll be able to give you more information about next year once the Office for Students comes into play. I think our advice to you would be is that where you see a new requirement, probably assume that you will be having to submit it. So assuming that your data requirements will come into line with the publicly funded higher education providers. However, we will be giving you more information about that next year once the Office for Students comes into force, and they're able to let us know what their requirements for you will be. So the next question says, how will annual matching, for example, matching to Student Loans Company or Pearson data work in the new schedule? I think the answer to that is that it's something that will have to be ongoing work around how that kind of matching will work. A lot of these processes are still under development and being defined, so it's something that hopefully we'll be able to give you more information about going forward, but at this point those have not been fully defined. So the next question is around reference periods when you've got starters at different points in the year, and whether that affects what the reference periods are for you. The answer is no. So the reference periods are set each year. As I mentioned earlier, there will be the same reference periods regardless of when your students start at different points in the year. You just submit the data to us as it happens and as it is applicable. But the reference periods and the sign-off points are the same for you, regardless of when your intakes and your exits generally happen in the structure of your courses throughout the year.
Yeah, so I think what that kind of, the crux of what that actually means is that what we have today is we have kind of an arbitrary annualisation of non-standard students. Effectively, those that start in January, say, we end up reporting 2/3 of them at the end of that year. What we would have under the new system is that you would tell us the 2/3 of information that you know about that point, and effectively that it's then up to Hisa and the customer to apportion that out as they see fit. So what it's trying to do is not force sort of the aggregation and the calculation and sort of a reporting cycle on your business processes, but actually take care of that within the actual collection and output system.
Okay, we've had a question around the 3 sign-offs a year and whether the same level of scrutiny will be required for each of those points throughout the year. The answer would be that we would require a level of scrutiny for each of those sign-offs. So when you sign off that data, you are confirming that it's been collected accurately and what's submitted to us is accurate, and it would be the same level of expectation of that throughout the year. So we recognise that is now 3 sign-offs a year. What we're hoping to do is make that a more streamlined process. So one thing we're looking at is an electronic sign-off rather than a paper sign-off. But yes, essentially we'll expect that sign-off to happen 3 times a year with the same level of scrutiny and accuracy at each stage. We've had a question around how providers preview the data to allow you to quality assure and correct it. The exact nature of those reports is under development, but as you have now, you submit data to us, we run validation and produce reports based on what you've submitted. So that will be presented back to you in different reports, probably something similar to what you've got now as a data supply file that presents that data to you. I think, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, that the intention is that those will relate to reference periods, so we'll be able to let you know what data you are signing off in a given reference period.
Yeah, I mean it's in general that's right. I mean I think one of the key things that we're working on at the minute is actually this synchronization of data and making sure that the view that Hisa holds of your data is the same as the view that you hold of your data. I mean what we have now is you send us the complete file and we can therefore process that file as a thing in and of itself. What we're kind of moving towards is that we have a view of data over time where that master record of data exists within your systems that we can't see. So there's a significant challenge around making sure that you have all the information you need to understand where there's both data quality issues that require attention, but also actually making sure that we've got the data that you think we've got. As Ruth said, the finer points of that are still being worked out, but we are very aware that that's a key success criteria for the system.
Thank you. Okay, the next question says, if the data is aggregated, how do we correct it through the sign-off period? So how do we send a correction for specific records? Or can we re-upload all the data for that period? So I think there's two sides to this. Firstly, if you're making a correction to an individual student's record, you do only need to send that student's record. You don't have to resubmit all of your students again. If you have a large group of students where no changes are required and another group of students where they are, you only need to tell us about the ones where those changes are required. The other side to that, I think, is around deletions. So at the moment, if you upload a student in error, for example, you've told us about a student that you didn't need to tell us about, you upload a new file and it overwrites the last one and we lose that student. In the new world, because everything is added together, you can't overwrite a student being in our system by just submitting a file without the minute. So we will have to have a process for deletions, and that could apply to an entire student if they weren't supposed to be submitted to us, but could also apply to subsets of data. If you've submitted something in error that just needs to be deleted from the system, there'll be a process for deleting that when you send the data to us.
So there is a third thing that's probably worth just clarifying on that as well, which is whilst we have the reference periods run sort of every 4 months, the kind of sign-off window that exists after that will primarily be focused on making sure the data for the previous reference period is quality assured. So the idea is that if you change something that was in scope for the previous reference period during the sign-off window, it will form part of the sort of disseminations and reports for that reference period. What we're not saying is that once we've got past the end of a reference period, any changes wait for 4 months before they get disseminated out. You can correct them as part of the sort of the wrapping up of the previous reference period.
Okay, we've had a question asking, will the fragments submitted all need to be in the main XML file structure? So, for example, one piece of data with everything else left blank. I think this is around if you want to make a correction to a small part of the model, do you need to submit the rest of the model at the same time? So the answer to that is no, you don't need to submit every entity in every file every time like you do at the moment. The full model is broken down into groups of entities. So we have parent and child groups. So if you want to correct something on a specific entity or a specific field, you need to submit only the entities that fall within that group.
Yeah, so an example of that, and hopefully a reasonable example of that, is if you're sending a student course session, for example, and that you want to change the student course session information about that, you may also need to send the information of the registration entity so that we know which student course session is the appropriate one to be updating. What you don't need to do is actually tell us who the student is again. It's just understanding where that entity or where that piece of information fits in with the broader model, and actually just sending us the bits of relevance. So it isn't having to send us the whole scope of the data model every time you send a file. It is just the bits of interest.
Sorry, I'm just having a look through your questions here.
So there's a question here around, will the new platform be providing an automated interface to Hisa, so similar to the UCAS ODBC and XML links? The actual mechanics of the input specification are being still discussed. Obviously, we have representatives from the software houses who are also helping advise us on the most appropriate way. We are kind of looking into all aspects. I think it perhaps feels that some of the more sophisticated sort of API type mechanisms are aspirational. They may not make it into the earlier releases. So I think, certainly it feels very much the minimum expectation is going to be something that's not massively dissimilar to now in terms of some kind of interface for loading XML files. As I say, we're not discounting anything at this point in time, but I think we just we haven't yet got clarity of what is the desired functionality.
So we've had a question asking, what portal will you be using to submit the data? So we are, at the moment you submit to our Hisa data collection system, we will have what will be referred to as the Hisa data platform, which will be a newly developed system that will allow us to manage an in-year collection. So you'll be submitting your files to that system, it will be processed in there, the data will be aggregated and reports produced. I also mentioned at this point that the intention is to have a data entry tool available to you. So I know a lot of smaller providers rely on the data entry tool to produce their files for submission to us. So we will also have a data entry tool available for you to help you with producing those files. Someone has asked, are there any plans for Hisa to provide a centralized student record system to all providers? I think at this stage, no, we've got no plans to produce any kind of centralized student record system. Sorry, we're just having a look at a question that's been submitted here.
Yeah, okay, so there's a question just coming in, specifically one that I answered in a previous webinar, around if it was easy for technology to submit all data at each reference point rather than just the fragments changes, and then the Hisa system would effectively work out what those changes are. Is that still correct? And yes, that is still correct. Our desired behaviour obviously is for you to submit just the information that has changed, but what we are very clear of is that's not going to be the behaviour that every provider out there is going to be able to achieve straight away. So yes, it's perfectly possible for a provider to all intents and purposes, resubmit a large file every single time, and for Hisa to just sift out the changes that are of interest and process those.
We've had a question here, are there any penalties for not submitting data in the reference periods that the students should have been? So if you've got students started in September, should have been included in reference period 1, but were ultimately submitted in reference period 2. So I think this would be an example of what I spoke about earlier around exception processing. So if you did have some students that should have existed in reference period 1, and they weren't submitted until reference period 2, you'd have their start dates and the start dates of their registration would be in a previous reference period, and that would be something that flagged up on the system as an issue. I don't think we know yet what the penalties or the exact process for that would be at this stage, but it would require some exception processing, and it would go through some kind of a process similar to we have now around the fixed database with authorization from your funding council in order to submit that data later than it should have been submitted. Do changes that happen in a reference period have to be reported before the end of that period? What happens if they aren't? Sorry, that's very similar to the last one. So I think the answer is yes. By the end of the sign-off period, after the reference period, we should know everything that you know about what happened during that reference period. And similar to the last question, if you then had to make amendments and changes in the following reference period, that would be subject to exception processing. So we've had a question about, I would like to understand more about what info will be required at each stage of the year. I think the simple answer to that is that there's not specific data that is required at particular points during the year. It's just dependent on your own internal structures and your provision that you have. So it's not that we will have certain data that's required at certain points. It's dependent on when certain events happen at your provider. So when your students join, when they leave, when they're enrolling in a new year. So it's not that data is required at different points. We do have on our website now a data specification that has all of the fields in there. So that shows the overall requirements of data, and when those are required is defined by what's going on in your provider rather than by Hisa's reference periods or anything like that.
Yeah, so in simple terms, the idea is that at the end of each reference period, Hisa should know everything it is that you know about the students and their progression and activities at that point. Obviously the negotiation with the customers is exactly what they're using each of those muster points of data for, and therefore each of the reference periods might have a slightly different focus in terms of what the customers are trying to get out of it. I mean, broadly speaking, if you look at the way the reference periods are structured, it's reasonable to assume that at reference period 1, just before Christmas, the focus is primarily about understanding student numbers, so getting the size of the population at that time. When you then move towards reference period 2 at March, the focus probably is more along the lines of continuation, progression, and sort of earlier activity. And then reference point 3 feels fairly analogous to the kind of closed cycle wash up of the current Hisa return.
We've had quite a few questions come in around the data entry tool and what functionality that will have. So around some around whether it will produce fragments or whether it will have an Excel import, that kind of thing. I think the exact functionality and exactly how it will look is still under development. But it will be available to allow you to produce the files to be submitted to Hisa. I don't believe there's an intention that we'll have an Excel upload function at the moment. And someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the exact details of it, how that will look, are still to be determined. So we'll give you more information about that as it becomes available.
Yeah, they are. I mean, I think in reasonably simple terms, I think if we look at the slide that was discussed around submission behaviour, where we're talking about a staging area, I'd suggest that the data entry tool is effectively acting as that staging area, and therefore the way that data entry tool interacts with the Hisa data collection system is probably going to be largely hidden to users of the data entry tool. It'll effectively communicate the information held within it when you feel comfortable that it can be. So the data entry tool, I'd suggest, is acting as that sort of provider side staging area.
Okay. It's 11 o'clock now, so I think we'll bring this to a close. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening in and for your questions. We haven't had a chance to get through all of them, but we will have a look through those that are left and hopefully be able to follow up with you for those of you whose questions we didn't get to answer. But thank you very much again for listening in, and have a lovely day.
Thank you.